A day in the country. Inspector Lightning didn't need a nickname, which suited his colleagues, as they could jokingly refer to him in his absence without reverting to an unkind sobriquet. Although he was very popular within the force, his name was a joke in itself. Inspector Lightning had, not unkindly, been referred to as a rather small and very sleepy sloth. He worked slowly, moved slowly, and spoke painfully slowly. But it had to be admitted that Inspector Amos Lightning always delivered the goods in the end. Rival detectives maintained that he bored confessions out of the culprits, but there was more to it than that, of course. No unnecessary flashing blue lights, ringing bells, wailing sirens, and other cowboy-like tactics for him. No, it was just gentle, inoffensive, plodding and observation that had got him his excellent reputation. It was good to be back on the job again in the police force so soon after the war. These atypical tactics proved their efficiency when he solved the Stanford Market case in a single day, although it nearly drove Sergeant Lamb round the bend. But then Lamb, reverting to paradoxes again, was like a bull in the proverbial china shop. The first notification Lightning had was when a call had finally been referred to him from the diminutive police station of Stanford Market. Someone had been found dead at their home in a small village. At first, Lightning wondered why he had been troubled with this information, and hadn't paid much attention to this piece of news, seeing as the deceased had been 85 years old. But when he was told that the reason he had been contacted was that the doctor had suspected strychnine poisoning, he began to stroke his moustache. A sure sign that the old bloodhound was, once again, about to embark on the trail with what passed for enthusiasm. The chauffeur drove him and his sergeant the 10 miles to the pretty little village. He was trying to clear his mind, but it was difficult to do so through the jabber of the painfully garrulous but most likeable Sergeant Lamb. When they eventually arrived, they easily found the police station in the main square, along with a pub and a tiny post office. Attractive cottages with thatched roofs and rose-festooned gardens spread out around the old marketplace, and Lightning immediately picked up the unmistakable scent of freshly baked bread coming from a side street. Yes, this would serve admirably as a temporary damper on Lamb's verbal output, as there was one thing that Lamb enjoyed more than the sound of his own voice, and that was eating. Lightning told him to go and chat to the baker, which was a humane way of putting both him and his sergeant out of their misery. As Lightning made his way towards the police station, the resident constable, an older man nearing retirement who wore glasses and a ginger moustache, came hurrying towards him, looking flustered. He saluted and then shook Lightning's hand. "Constable Hughes, sir. Bad news, I'm afraid, sir," he blurted out. "Oh, dear," said Lightning slowly. "2 more deaths this morning, sir. Terrible. The doctor seems adamant. Same symptoms, apparently. It's horrible," he said. "Just horrible." He watched Lightning's face for some reaction, and wondered if he'd been heard. It was most frustrating. He then started to polish his glasses to fill in the embarrassing silence, but jumped when Lightning suddenly said, "I'd like to, use your, telephone." They went into the police station, where Lightning phoned headquarters. He would be needing backup now that this wasn't an isolated case. When he'd finished, he put the phone down and looked at the constable. "I'd like to, see the, doctor," he asked. The constable was grateful that a superior from police headquarters had arrived to take the responsibility in this unfamiliar situation, but the inspector's unhurried manner made him wonder if he was the right man for the job. They found the doctor at a nearby cottage, comforting a woman in a pink candlewick dressing gown who had visibly been crying a lot. The constable was thanked and relieved of his presence, but he left rather reluctantly. Stanford Market wasn't the scene of a crime like this every day. At the inspector's invitation, he and the doctor, who wore pince-nez glasses, went around to the back of the house. They wandered into the small, neat garden with its roses and trestle arches, and a rather over-elaborate bird table, which Lightning stopped in front of and seemed to be examining in great detail. Neither man had spoken, and the doctor was beginning to feel invisible. "Well, Doctor," Lightning said abruptly, turning to the doctor. Strychnine." He was, to say the least, economic with his words. "Yes, I believe so," answered the doctor, relieved at the sudden animation. "Everything indicates that it is. Terrible spasms, arched back, extreme facial grimace, and eyes open after death. These are very much the same symptoms as tetanus and lockjaw, but the chances of 3 people having tetanus and lockjaw within a small space of time is most unlikely. No, this leads me to think that perhaps this is not a coincidence." "Time of, death?" Lightning said slowly, looking at his own watch. "All 3 deaths occurred between 7 a.m. and 9 a.m., just during or after they had had breakfast, I'd say," he answered. Silence. Had the inspector heard what he'd said? "Where's the kitchen?" drawled Lightning. They went back into the cottage. A neighbour who had come to comfort the woman in the dressing-gown led Lightning to the kitchen where the breakfast table stood, noticeably left in a hurry. She began instinctively to clear the things away, but Lightning gently took hold of her wrist and slowly shook his head. She hovered a while, and then returned to her neighbour in the next room, leaving him poking at the contents of the plate with a knife. Marmalade, butter, cornflakes, milk, tea, bread. The mind boggled. He'd sent lamb to the baker's, and the expression "like lamb to the slaughter" suddenly popped into his head. So he was more than relieved when something large blocked out the light coming through the open kitchen door. "Ah, there you are, Lamb," he said. He noticed crumbs on Lamb's uniform jacket, but the sergeant seemed to be in fine form. Lamb's eyes flicked over the contents of the table and the rest of the breakfast and thought back to the warm, fresh roll he had just eaten. Maybe he should have waited for the jam and butter. "Got a bit of an empty tummy too, sir?" he smiled sheepishly, noticing the knife in the inspector's hand. Lightning returned his smile and took some plastic bags out of his pocket. Using one like a glove, he placed the bread in one bag, the butter in another, the pot of homemade jam in another, and other items off the table in another, sealed them and passed them to Lamb. "Why, thank you, sir," he said gratefully, thinking of the warm bread. "Now, take these back to town, Lamb, as fast as you can." He locked eyes with his sergeant. "To the lab," he stipulated. "Oh," said Lamb, looking disappointed. "Right-ho, sir." He turned to go. "Oh, and, Lamb." "Yes, sir," answered Lamb, enthusiastic to get back to the car. "Ask the lads to test everything for strychnine or any other poisons." Lamb swallowed, looked at the bags, held them a little away from his body and muttered, "Right you are, sir," and left Lightning grinning on his own. Lamb had his qualities, but greed was not one of them. The woman in the dressing-gown answered Lightning's questions through sobs that touched the inspector's heart. He would never get used to witnessing fresh grief. He then went to see the families of the other 2 victims, and it was very much the same story there. The old lady's son, a farmer, had found his mother dead on the floor by the breakfast table. Oh, she looked horrible, sir, and no, he couldn't think of anyone they could call an enemy. The 3rd victim had been old Jake, something of a personality in the village, but although he was a little difficult, he hadn't got what anyone could call a true enemy in the world. Inspector Lightning sat on a bench in the village square, with only the sound of early swifts and other birds breaking into his thoughts. But he didn't sit for long. 2 police cars arrived with the wailing sirens, bells, and blue flashing lights, unnecessarily disturbing the peace. But he was relieved to see them, as there had to be some fast action if more deaths were to be avoided. On a hunch, the first order he gave as a precaution was to stop all sale and consumption of bread. and to shut the bakery until further notice. Next stop, the pub. A quiet word with the publican should do it, and the pub had always been the best place to glean those little all-important fragments of information. The White Hart was the epitome of the old-fashioned country pub. Comfortable armchairs around an open fireplace, lampshades and horse brasses, corny but somehow attractive as they winked in the firelight. Sun poured through the coloured leaded glass, and there was a smell of good liquor and simple food. The publican himself stood behind the bar, polishing glasses and chatting to his patrons. At this time of day there were plenty of clients. The publican was a jovial chap with rosy cheeks, someone happy with his lot. The conversation idled a little when Lightning came in, but soon picked up again after he had placed his order. Shepherd's pie and a light ale would do nicely. He went to wash his hands and managed to have a quick word with the publican in private, after which he knew he could count on this sensible man to lie convincingly about running out of bread. Lightning sat back and listened to the conversation. Unsurprisingly, it was just about the very subject he had wanted to eavesdrop on. "Simpson's not going to be out of work then," said one wag, a little worse for wear even at this early hour. This remark was followed by a few timid laughs. "Yeah," replied his drinking companion. "Bleeding money bags, that one." "Not his fault, though," said the wag. "It's his bloody missus, her and that house." "Some people have no respect for the dead," came from another. But just as conversation started to be interesting and Lightning was halfway through his meal, the pub door flew open and a furious-looking man with a massive paunch covered with a white apron stormed into the pub. He strode over to Lightning and pointed an accusing finger at him.
"Are you the man from the police?"
he bellowed. He was very red in the face. Lightning calmly finished his mouthful and looked up slowly. "Yes," he said quietly, "I am." The pub had gone silent.
"What's the meaning of shutting down my bakery? You've got no right."
He waited for an answer to his question, but the policeman went on eating. It was infuriating. By this time all eyes were on the inspector, waiting in anticipation. Eventually, Lightning looked up, and pointing at his own glass with his knife, he tilted his head in silent invitation and smiled slightly.
"Well,"
said the baker, albeit begrudgingly.
"I don't mind if I do."
And he parked his massive body on the chair opposite the inspector. When his beer arrived, he downed half of it in one go and looked at the policeman in hope of some enlightenment. But it was obvious that none was forthcoming in the immediate future. Finally, Lightning put down his knife and fork, wiped his mouth with his napkin, folded it slowly and looked up at the baker. "Inspector Lightning," said the policeman, offering his hand. The baker took it and introduced himself as Arthur Blunt. Lightning bent towards Blunt. "I have requested that you shut your bakery because—" and then he took a sip of bitter. "I believe it is necessary as a temporary measure until I've finished with my inquiries." The baker looked bewildered. Why couldn't the man formulate a proper bloody sentence? He stared at the policeman in a sort of semi-trance, which was broken only by the ringing of a telephone. The barman called the inspector over to the bar. Lightning stood up and took the receiver. "Uh-huh. Mm-hmm.
Seems to be strychnine poisoning."
"Uh-huh. Mumbled Lightning and put the phone down and looked over at Blunt. Blunt felt uneasy under the scrutiny of this strange little man. Finally, Lightning came back to the table, sat down, smoothed his moustache, cleared his throat, and leant towards the baker in confidence. "Strychnine found in your bread," he said simply, and then leant back to watch the reaction. It was a noisy one, but without a doubt that of an innocent man, and Lightning let him rave while he ate his portion of apple pie. When he had finished, and the baker had calmed down a bit, He finally stood up, thanked and paid the publican for his meal and Blunt's drink, and gently steered the confused baker outside. He pulled out a pipe and started packing it with fresh tobacco. Mr. Blunt, do you know, a man?" he asked, lighting his pipe and puffing at it. Blunt looked as if he was about to burst into tears of frustration. When the pipe was fully underway and the inspector pulled it out of his mouth, he finished his sentence. "A man named, Simpson."
Of course I do. Everybody does. Look, Mr. Inspector Lightning. You don't think I've been putting poison in my bread, do you? What would be the point of killing off all my customers? I've got nothing to do with this, you must believe me.
"I do," he answered. He took a few more puffs on his pipe, until they were both enshrouded with a good billow of smoke. "Who is Mr. Simpson, Mr. Blunt?" Blunt told him. Been seeing him at all, recently?" asked the inspector.
Yes, as a matter of fact I have.
Said Blunt, relieved to bring a little interest to the stilted conversation.
Oh, feel sorry for the poor bugger, actually. Says he suffers from insomnia and I'm the only person awake in the wee hours, so he comes over for a chat. I don't mind, of course. Grateful for a bit of company. It gets lonely when the missus and the whole village is asleep, but I'm not surprised he doesn't sleep with all his troubles. House to pay off, kids at the best schools, and that dreadful spendthrift wife of his. Honestly, Inspector, I don't know how he makes ends meet."
The phone box?" asked Lightning, still tinkering with his pipe.
"Over there, behind the post office."
"Ta," said the inspector as he walked away. He stopped and turned towards the open-mouthed baker. "Oh, and, Mr. Blunt."
"Yes?"
"Keep it shut,"
"Oh, I wouldn't speak to a soul, sir."
said Blunt, looking slightly offended. "I know that. I meant the shop,"
"Oh, right you are."
said the baker, as he watched the curious little man walk away. Within an hour, Lightning had the search warrant he had been asking for, and accompanied by the police who had arrived earlier, and the now eager Constable Hughes, he made his way to the large Tudor-style house which stood rather ostentatiously in its own little private park. Only Mrs. Simpson was at home, and from the moment she opened the door, Lightning asked himself one private little question. If her husband turned out to be the guilty party, why hadn't he used the strychnine to get rid of her? She had a tight-lipped, disapproving little face, and blinked too much. Her strident voice objected to them coming into her house, and when she realized that she had no say in the matter, she squawked at the men.
"Wipe your filthy shoes, and don't break anything."
Lace doilies covered almost every polished surface, and the policemen looked like a flock of tortured sheep as they virtually tiptoed through the spotless house of horrors. However, they needn't even have bothered with the house at all, as it was a triumphant but foul-smelling Constable Hughes, who finally discovered the packet containing the poison in a pile of manure kept behind the garden shed. Mrs. Simpson complained that she was starting to feel faint. She made a most valiant attempt at faking a Hollywood-style collapse, but it was most unfortunate that of the 7 able-bodied men standing near her, not one of them was quick enough to catch her before she fell to the floor. Well, thought Lightning to himself as he left the house and its irate occupant, that settles that. He got into the car and leaned forward to tell the driver where to go to find the unfortunate, misguided, but no doubt guilty Mr. Simpson. He called out to Lamb, who had arrived with a couple of men from headquarters, and the sergeant hurried over. "Lamb," he said through the open window, "the baker, Lamb. Tell him he can open tomorrow after the boys have been through there." He tapped his driver on the shoulder and started to roll the window up, leaving Lamb looking forlorn in the middle of the road, none the wiser as to the outcome of the inquiry. Suddenly the car screeched to a halt and reversed. Lightning rolled the window back down again and stuck his head out. And, Lamb, said the inspector, looking at his watch. Yes, sir. Getting late, Lamb. Pub's shepherd's pie. Bloody good. And he winked. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, replied Lamb, still baffled, but smiling at the departing cars as they headed off towards the town, where the unfortunate henpecked Mr. Simpson ran his increasingly unprofitable funeral parlour.